So the purpose of this lecture is to introduce students to basic church history, including important periods in Christian history, the ecumenical councils, and the first Christological debates. Now, I want to begin by asking you a question. What tradition, what Christian tradition do you belong to? Indeed, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of various different Christian denominations. And if we look at this tree, which I think is really, really helpful in indicating where certain denominations came from and the roots and the origins of that particular denomination, isn't it true, though, that all of our Christian denominations originated from Judaism and then Jesus? And then we see the Great Schism of 1054, which I'll get to a little bit later, and then Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and how the various Protestant denominations came about, including, say, the Reformed tradition, which is the tradition that I'm a part of. And so the process by which each of these denominations emerged and why certain denominations emerged, what sorts of issues, what sorts of conflicts, what was the historical background, the key figures, the key issues, the key cultural background, all these questions and all these thoughts is something that the discipline of Christian history, Christian church history, considers. And here, of course, a timeline of the 2,000 years or so of church history, of Christian church history. There are a lot of watershed moments, great figures, great people, great events. But here we see, perhaps in too short a form, some of the most important events of Christian church history, starting with the New Testament era, and then the 7 ecumenical councils, the Great Schism, which was the first big major split, and then the next great major split in 1517. And so here's a basic timeline of church history. And so what this lecture will do is sort of go through some of the most important events of church history. Here are some important dates that might be very important for you. For example, 33 CE, which is Pentecost. And in Pentecost, we have an event where tongues from all over the world came together. We have the first 7 ecumenical councils. That's where we have the councils of, say, Nicaea or Chalcedon, where the doctrines on Christ and the Trinity were formulated, which we talked about earlier in this lecture course. We have 312, in which the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, resulting in the 313 Edict of Milan, in which Christianity became a religion that before had been something to persecute, and rather it completely transformed into something where it was accepted and maybe even encouraged until 380, when Christianity became the official state religion. And then that's when Christianity spread all across the empire. And then we have the Great Schism of 1054, in which the Western Church, centered in Rome, and the Eastern Church, centered in Constantinople, they separated for a variety of cultural and theological issues. And then the Reformation in 1517, which is another split that happened in the Western Church, led by Martin Luther and others. And so there are various ways to categorize church history, but one way in which Wilmington does it is the apostolic age. This is the period of the disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and towards the end, around 100 CE, when John, who was considered the youngest of the disciples, he finally passed. And then we have the persecution period, in which the Christian church and the Christians were persecuted and killed. Initially, the persecution was something that happened locally and sporadically, and then eventually became more of a systematized, empire-wide, organized persecution. And then we have the other eras of church history as well. So the Apostolic Age, from about AD 30 to 100 or CE, Pentecost to the death of John, key figures, the disciples, Peter, Paul, John, but not only Peter, Paul, John, but we also have what are called the Apostolic Fathers, who weren't direct apostles of Christ, but who knew the apostles of Christ. And those who perhaps even were taught under the apostles of Christ. People like Clement of Rome, or Ignatius of Antioch, or Polycarp of Smyrna. And perhaps the text that can orient us towards what this first Christian church might have been is Ephesians 11, where then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. And then we have the persecutions from about 100 to 313. Here you see a picture of the Emperor Nero fiddling as the city burns. Now, this is a popular story, but historians say it likely did not happen. But this is interesting because, according to Tacitus and Christian tradition, Nero blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, initiating his persecution of Christians. And so even though Nero playing his music, gleefully watching the city burn, maybe that may be something that's apocryphal, but it's probably likely that Nero scapegoated the Christians for what happened. So Nero in Rome, Trajan in 98 to 117 similarly. But towards the end, we have more systematic persecutions, empire-wide, more organized, say by Marcus Aurelius, or what's called the Great Persecution, culminating in the Emperor Diocletian's really severe persecutions of the Christians. And in our Christian imaginations, we have these ideas of the catacombs, right, where Christians would hide underground to hide from the Romans who are trying to kill these Christians. And the picture that you see here is from the movie Gladiator, and we have the Emperor Diocletian on the Marcus Aurelius on the left, and we have Russell Crowe on the right. Now, of course, in this movie, Marcus Aurelius is portrayed as this great, benevolent, and kind man. And maybe he was, but what we do know is, though, that he persecuted the Christians. Between 250 and 311, over 60,000 Christians were put to death. However, surprisingly, Christian population actually increased, went from 3 to 7 million, representing 15% of the entire persecution or population. And so after the Emperor Constantine's conversion in 312 and the Edict of Milan, and eventually Christianity becoming a state religion in 380, we have what are called the 7 ecumenical councils, starting with the First Council of Nicaea, where we talked about the identity of Jesus Christ, whether he's God or not. And we have the First Council of Constantinople, and the Council of Ephesus, and the Council of Chalcedon, and so on and so forth. And the purpose of these 7 ecumenical councils was for Christians all over the empire to come together in order to be able to discuss and codify what exactly they believed in. Now, it's the 4th century, so 2 centuries or so have passed since Christ died, since the apostles died. And so you can imagine that during these 200, 300 years, there emerged a wide variety of understandings on a wide variety of theological disciplines and ideas and topics. And so it was actually quite wise for the leaders of these Christian churches to come together to discuss through prayer and through the influence of the Holy Spirit some of the key orthodox doctrines of the Christian faith. And despite the fact that there are now many, 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 many different denominations, what all these Christian traditions hold true are the decisions of these 7 ecumenical councils, including the doctrine of the Trinity, including the God-man identity of Jesus Christ, and so forth. So we talk so much about the difference between, say, the Protestant Church and the Roman Catholic Church, but the similarities are the 7 ecumenical councils.